Welcome to Empowering Plans, a show dedicated to identifying waste and undue expense in the health benefits industry, discovering ways to maximize benefits while minimizing costs, and empowering employers, administrators, and consultants to emphasize, once again, the benefit in benefit plan. Today's episode is brought to you by the Phia Group, empowering plans since 1999. Now here are your hosts, the Phia Group's own CEO, Adam Russo, and Senior Vice President and General Counsel, Ron Peck.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Empowering Plans, sponsored by the Phia Group. I am your co-host, Adam Russo. Alongside with me is our Senior VP and General Counsel, Ron Peck. Say hello, Ron.
Hello, Ron.
And guys, let's be honest. There's no way we could have had this podcast today without our DC expert, in-house expert, Attorney Brady Bizarro. Say hello, Brady.
Hello, Brady.
Brady, we are excited about this podcast today. Before we get into it, I just want everyone to know that on May 16, 2017, we'll be having our next webinar talking about what type of plan design is right for you. So please feel free to go to www.fiagroup.com or go on our social media pages, whether it's on Facebook or LinkedIn, to see how you can register and listen to our webinar, or even hear some audio and watch some video and see some slides on our past webinars as well. So Brady, I know I got a whole list of questions here. I know, Ron, you want to just jump right into it, but let's just get right into it at the beginning. What happened last week, buddy?
Well, yeah, I mean, this bill really came out of nowhere and passed rather quickly. You'll recall that the end of March, there was a pretty big disaster when the first bill introduced in the House went down, not enough votes. It was pulled from the floor. And since then, there's been a few amendments that have been added to sort of placate two factions in the Republican Party. There's the Freedom Caucus, which are members which are more conservative, and they tend to want a full repeal of the ACA. Then you have the more moderate Republicans who are more concerned about people losing access to coverage and things like that.
Experts were saying as recently as last Monday that all of this repeal and replace was dead. So what changed, and how is this version of the bill any different than the one that obviously failed miserably back on March 24th?
Right, so the experts were wrong, and surprise, they were wrong also in November, by the way. But one of the things that happened quickly was that amendments were added, and the most recent one that was added, the two that are important we're going to talk about in detail, was called the MacArthur Amendment, and then after that, the Upton Amendment. And basically, these amendments were aimed at both repealing, in a way, the essential health benefits of the ACA to sort of do what the more conservative members wanted, but also providing more money for state high-risk pools, basically to pick up the slack in what was expected to be a loss of coverage for people that had pre-existing conditions or people who had otherwise high costs of care. And so that amendment was literally offered at the 11th hour as a way to add, it was $8 billion added into these high-risk pools. And they did the whip count, and they said, hey, we have enough votes. And they said, let's not wait for the CBO report, the Congressional Budget Office report. Let's get this voted on now, because the House members are on recess as of last week, and they wanted to, before they went home to face constituents, say, hey, look, we have some kind of victory. We can say that we're on the road to repealing and replacing.
Brady, so you mentioned the CBO, and I'm glad that you did, because you might recall with the original bill, the CBO pretty much is the one who sank it. That they gave at least the taglines that were used both in the media and politically to sink the first version of the bill. But this time they pushed it through before the CBO reviewed it, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that from you. One, how is it that they got that done? And two, when can we expect to hear from the CBO? And in light of the fact that, like you said, more money is being thrown into this and to ensure coverage, are we potentially going to see a price tag that might price this bill out of the market as far as the Senate is concerned?
Right, so it's no surprise that this was rushed through to prevent the CBO from giving an updated score, because what's expected is a bad score. The first time around, it was pretty terrible. They estimated about 24 million people would lose coverage by 2026 because of a number of things, like reducing the Medicaid expansion by eliminating the penalty for not having insurance, things like that. But it also estimated a savings of $337 billion over 10 years. You can expect an updated score when it comes out, and it will come out before the Senate takes this up, because the Senate Majority Leader has said they're going to wait for the CBO report. What we think is going to happen is that you'll see less in savings because of the fact that more money is being added in this bill, And I think you're still going to see a good number of people lose coverage, because if you get rid of the mandates and you roll back the Medicaid expansion, you're going to see fewer people will have coverage going forward.
Like you mentioned, 2026. So the reality is, with the savings that they will create, obviously there could be fixes that can be made between 2017 and 26 as the years go by. I mean, don't forget, the Cadillac tax was the big discussion back in 2007. Nothing ever happened with that. So, a lot of this stuff, obviously, as the years go by, repair made, allocations can be made, money can be diverted, different things can be done so that the number of quote-unquote uninsureds isn't as high as they expect it to be right now.
Right, and the thing to remember with a lot of these score reports and estimates, and even frankly budgets, is that they're always projected out about 10 years. So it's over 10 years, but in the intervening years, look with the ACA, you could have a full repeal happen in between those times. So we have to be careful to take too much stock in. But in this particular case, though, the CBO is seen as a bipartisan commission. People really take what they say at face value. They're giving the impact of this bill. And so to vote on it without having the updated report was kind of a big deal. And that's why you're seeing now Senate Republicans saying, hey, we're going to wait for the updated score report before we move on this bill.
But as Ron alluded to, the reason why they had this vote is because they just didn't want to go home without having done anything.
That's right, yeah. And they wanted to get this through quickly. And it was basically a matter of counting. And once they had 216 votes or 217 votes, that's when they rushed to the floor and got this passed.
So a couple of questions. Pretty simple, actually. How is Trump care different than Obamacare? Is it really a repeal, if at all, or is it just a modification? And were any popular parts of the ACA or Obamacare, put aside?
So we could start with, was this a real repeal? I mean, I think the answer is frankly no, it was not, because to actually really fully repeal the ACA, you need a vote. You need 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, and you need a legislative change. All the changes that were made to the ACA and this new AHCA were changes that affected the budget. So, for example, things like, well, you have to pay a penalty for not having insurance. Well, in this case, under the AHCA, you won't. So there no longer will be penalties assessed against employers and individuals for not carrying coverage. What else is different? Well, the subsidies themselves, which are hugely important under the ACA, they were based on your income. And now under the AHCA, they're based more on your age, and for higher income earners, they're phased out. So that's a big difference. Obviously, the Medicaid changes are pretty big. The ACA expanded Medicaid in all the states, basically or the states that chose, rather, to expand, basically putting people who were just above the poverty line on the Medicaid rolls. This bill rolls that back. So you're going to have a lot of people who are just over the federal poverty line who no longer qualify for Medicaid under the AHCA. As for things that were kept that were popular, yeah, things were kept. The biggest one of which was keeping dependent children on their parents' plans until age 26. That was very popular, and that's not changing. And the other thing that was, in effect, kept but is very controversial is the ban on pre-existing conditions, because essentially what you have in this new bill is two waivers that are allowed for the states to pick what they want to cover. And we're going to get more into that in more detail, but those are the two things I think that primarily were changed that are very important in this new bill.
Okay, so, it's all very interesting. We're all, citizens of the United States of America. We care about the laws and the news, but let's face it, who do we represent? We represent employers, self-funded benefit plans, right, and employees who are covered by these plans. So while it's all very interesting, it seems to me like a lot of what we're hearing and seeing as far as this law and changes to Obamacare that are being made, it's really impacting the individual exchange market and Medicaid. I'm going to try and limit the scope a little for ourselves and our listeners. What does this actually mean for employment-based, employer-based health plans, and more specifically, self-funded benefit plans? And, again, is there anything that our industry needs to do right now to prepare for this law?
Yeah, so great question. As we know, 159 million Americans get their insurance through their employer. And there are a number of things actually in this bill that will have an impact on employer-sponsored insurance and for self-funded insurers in particular. First of which, as I mentioned before, the repeal of the employer mandate. So by effectively zeroing out the penalties, you may have some employers who decide, okay, I don't want to offer insurance. I'm too small of an employer. We think that the the estimates from the CBO on the number of people who will drop their employer coverage is probably a bit overstated. The reality is, if you have a good workforce and you're a good employer, you're going to offer benefits to keep talented people on your on the roll. So you're going to still offer benefits. So, but the mandate will certainly have an impact. Secondly, and the big one here is this issue about waivers. I mentioned before that a couple amendments were added to this bill to help get it passed. The big one in the MacArthur Amendment was the ability for states to obtain a waiver from HHS that would essentially say, I don't want to cover essential health benefits. So as we know, as it stands now in the self-funded industry, you as a self-funded health plan would pick a state as a benchmark, and you would sort of tie your definition of essential health benefits to how that state defined EHBs. And the reality was, because of the ACA requirements, there wasn't that much variation between the states. I mean, there's a couple things that were different, but generally you had the same types of things being covered: emergency care, maternity care, preventive care, prenatal care, things like that, and prescription drug care as well. This new waiver provision will essentially let a state say, I want to pick and choose which ones I want to cover, or none at all. And then a self-funded plan could say, okay, Alaska, for example, hypothetically, they pick very few benefits they want to cover. A self-funded plan could pick Alaska as the state benchmark they want to use. And then going forward, they'd only have to cover essential health benefits as defined by that state. So that's a big deal, because essentially you could, as an employer now, tailor certain plans you want to offer to your employees. And you could say, well, I want to offer fewer benefits to people who don't need them, or more benefits to others. And so this is going to be a big deal.
So as long as one state just decides to limit or almost eliminate essential health benefits, right, you could theoretically have a bunch of employers decide, we're going to follow the rules of that particular state, whether it's Wyoming or whatever, and you happen to be in New York, and be able to get away with it. That'd be legal.
Yeah, and there's a concern here, we're too early to tell, but there is something called, in academia, the race to the bottom, where you have one state or one industry doing one thing with less requirements, and everyone's jumping on board to follow suit with that.
Sure. The good comparison, and I've heard this before and thought of this myself also, when you look at credit cards and other corporations, they like to incorporate in Delaware because the laws there are favorable. It's the same idea here as there. The other thing, Brady, and real quick, is I actually saw this, was that with essential health benefits, there's this rule with self-funded plans that if it's an essential health benefit and you're going to offer it, it's sort of all or nothing. You're not required to provide it, but if you do, there's no cap, there's no limit. Here, what they're saying now is that you can, if you identify a state where it's not an essential health benefit, let's say maternity care, you will now be able to offer maternity care, so it's not that you're not offering it, but you could put caps or limits on those benefits.
I saw that actually this morning, and that was the article was basically titled "A Loophole That Was Found," and that was about basically the ban on lifetime limits that was under the ACA, as you mentioned, Ron, would not be in effect going forward for states that redefine certain things not as essential health benefits. So if you have AIDS or cancer or some other condition, and previously your insurer could not place limits on it, well, if your insurer now picks a state that does not define care for that particular malady as an essential health benefit, then yeah, they'd be able to place limits on that, lifetime limits.
And here's the bottom line. I mean, we're in the consulting business. Every day we get questions from various employers or brokers across the country asking us if there's a way to put a cap or limit certain benefits on certain types of conditions for their self-funded employee benefit plan, because it's just getting too expensive. That's the bottom line. Last question, and Brady, great information, by the way. Where do we go from here? What's the next step? And at the end of the day, are there any winners or losers in the industry, in D.C., in politics in general? What's going to happen?
Well, so I'm going to take the easy question first, which is who are the winners and losers. I think, and the media is pretty much saying this too, and I think they're right. If you're young and healthy, you win in this bill. If you're very wealthy, you have a good job with a good salary, you're helped here. If you have employer insurance, then you're helped here. You're a winner. But if you're poor, if you're on Medicaid, if you're just above the line there, if you have a condition that is very costly, you're probably going to be at risk. You have to rely on these high risk pools. The more difficult question is where we're going next, and that's a very confusing answer. And I'll just try to be a bit brief if I can. But essentially, what has to happen is the Senate, who is, by the way, writing their own bill, before they can take up a version of that bill, they have to go through a procedure called a parliamentarian. Now, what is that? It's actually a person in D.C., and she has to decide whether the changes being made to Obamacare only affect the budget or not. I said before that the budgetary process is such that you only can make changes to the bill that affect the budget, and those require 51 votes to pass in the Senate. So that's the careful line being tread right now in the Senate, is they only want to make changes that affect the budget so they can pass this with Republicans only. If it's found that the bill is making changes, or whatever version the Senate drafts, if that's found to make changes that are affecting the legislation itself, they'll need 60 votes. And so either way, Republicans only have 52 senators in the Senate. They have a very slim majority, and they can only afford to lose 3 votes. So they're going to have to add things in the Senate bill, I think, to do more for people with pre-existing conditions, to help people with costly conditions, because you have a lot of moderate senators like Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, the same kind of senators you hear over and over again who are always sort of on the more moderate side. You've got to do all you can to help get them on board and help them pass this bill. But I think either way, this is going to take a few more months. I mean, I've heard people say, oh, well, next week, but the Senate moves very slowly, and that's basically designed that way. But I think we'll have something by the end of the summer that either their own version that's passed, but once that's done, both chambers have to get together in conference and iron out the differences, and then both chambers have to vote again on that bill before it gets to President Trump's desk.
Great stuff, Brady. Obviously, folks, we can go on for hours if we had the ability to, but we all have to get back to work, well, at least I do. I think Ron has a little bit of work on his desk as well. So what I'd like to let everyone know is on May 16th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time is our next webinar. Brady will be a special guest at that webinar. We will discuss in more detail what's going on in D.C., if anything is going on in Congress, and what's going to be in store for us for the next few months. So on behalf of Brady, on behalf of Ron, and myself, and all of us here at the Phia Group, thank you for listening to our podcast today, and we hope that you keep on empowering your plans. Thank you.